97.5% of trans or gender diverse youth continue to identify as transgender or non-binary 5 years after initially socially transitioning.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. Lane Kantor is my guest for this third episode of Pride Month. Lane is an MD with a master's degree in public health. Recently, Lane and their colleagues conducted a study of the knowledge gaps and educational needs of the parents of transgender and non-binary kids. Lane shares what they learned and recommendations for supporting kids as they realize their identities and how they want to express them. This podcast was sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
I'm transgender and non-binary myself, so I always come at this work from a personal and as well as a professional lens. And then professionally, I recently graduated from medical school. I'm starting my medical residency in internal medicine and pediatrics at UPenn and CHOP in Pennsylvania. And throughout my career so far, I've been working in research and with the goal of providing gender-affirming care to adults and children. I've also been on the WPATH board, which is the organization that publishes the standards of care for trans folks. So I've come at this from the professional lens of what do our kids and adults need and how can we make sure that we can get that for them. And then the third realm is that I have a political interest in this and a political investment in this work. So though we can do a lot to help parents and families support trans youth, I try to approach this work from a structural lens. So we know that these systems of white supremacy and colonialism and racial capitalism make it harder for certain transgender and non-binary youth to exist. So even with all the parental support in the world, we have to do the things that help other people get access. So
Right.
universal health care and all of that. So that's kind of where I come at this work from.
That's a lot, obviously. And there's so much that we could talk about in those different things. But I do want to, because you recently published a study about what families know and what they don't know. And what kind of inspired this particular research project?
Yeah, so we had two big research questions and we wanted to understand a couple of things. So one was the unique educational needs of the youth themselves. And we wanted to hear through the voices and opinions of the youth, of parents and providers, as well as finding out where they're accessing this information. And that was actually in two separate papers that have already been published, which we can link to in the show notes as well. And then the one that this paper was about the unique educational needs of the parents of these youth. And again, we wanted to do this through the voices and opinions of youth, parents, and providers. And one of the things that made this a little bit unique is that most studies looking at the needs of parents only spoke to parents instead of asking youth what tools they wish their parents had had at the time to support them. Then the other big difference was that a lot of studies in this case interviewed youth under 18, but we wanted to have youth who were a little bit older and could reflect back and say things like, oh, well, when I was 17, and so this was an example of something one of the youths told us. They said, when I was younger and a teenager, I wasn't binding safely. And my mom didn't know about chest binding safety, so she wasn't able to help me.
Right.
And I was able to say, no, it's fine. And she just had to take my word for it. And I think parents should know about that information. So that was a really helpful insight that we got from kind of talking to these people after they've gone through their actual adolescence.
Let's talk about some of the things that you learned about what parents kind of definitively do not know.
Yeah. So one of the themes that kind of came out from everybody was this theme of kids needing to teach parents about gender and sexuality related.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big differences was that a lot of parents described this as positive and comfortable. And they said, my kid liked teaching me about these topics. And then a lot of the youth said, I don't want to always be the sole source of information.
Yeah, not so much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was one thing, which kind of having parents try to find a way to learn about some of this stuff on their own, and not the type of things like who are you and how can you tell me about
Hmm.
what I can do to help you, but some of the basics of kind of gender and sexuality 101. What is gender identity? What is gender expression? What's sexual orientation? What is a non-binary identity? How to use pronouns? Those kinds of things that don't relate to you asking your kid to tell you about themselves, but kind of stuff that they can learn elsewhere, either through community or through online resources.
I thought that was interesting, and I think that listeners of the Talking About Kids podcast will recognize that this tracks across many different things that adolescents go through, and that they want their parents to be adults. They want adults in their life, right? And so, I saw this. I when I was reading your paper, that struck me because here we saw these parents saying that they enjoyed or they were open to learning about these issues from their kids, but we had the kids saying, I kind of want the adults in my life to know more about this. I don't want to have to teach them. I want to be able to rely on them more. So I thought that was really powerful. You also learned though that there were things that the parents in your study didn't know and that they honestly wanted to know more about. What were some of those things?
Yeah, so we identified kind of six big topics. And that first one was the kind of gender and sexuality 101, which we kind of just talked about in terms of facilitating some of these conversations. So, um, like we talked about, difference between sex and gender identity, what is a non-binary identity, how to use inclusive language. So something like asking kids how they want to refer to their own body parts rather than assuming. And then how to use the right pronouns or how to use they them pronouns. So all of that was part of in the gender and sexuality component. And then importantly in this section, there was also this theme of parents learning that transgender identity is not a phase. And
Mm,
this obviously is coming up a lot in the media right now.
hmm.
Um, and so, I'll just I'll get on my high horse and present a few statistics,
Yeah.
which is one of the biggest papers that recently came out. A 2022 peer-reviewed study in the Journal of Pediatrics found that 97.5% of trans or gender diverse youth continue to identify as transgender or non-binary 5 years after initially socially transitioning. And social transition is,
Wow.
changing a name or a pronoun or a gender presentation, so not a medical transition. So telling somebody in their lives that they identify a certain way and doing something about it. So that is very good. And another study which kind of looked at of that very, very, very small percent of people who do detransition or do later, change their identity or report a different identity. Of those, in a recent study, 82.5% of those said a big factor of that was social or cultural stigma about being trans or gender diverse, not about
Mm.
their identity changing. So that was kind of one of the ones that came up a lot. And a lot of the parents said that too, where they said, when I first heard this information, I was worried that this was a phase, and I learned later that it is not. But I'm worried about the way that I harmed my child by questioning them
Hmm.
and asking them if this was going to change. And so that was one of the things that came up from youth, parents, and providers.
And so I want to push back on this just for a tiny bit because, what I was taught and when I was in school is that all of our identity and orientation development during adolescence is, well, it's not a straight line. For anybody coming to realize what their orientation is and what their identity is has steps, and it's a meandering path, and there's often regression, right? So if you ultimately end up identifying as gay and male, for example, there's going to be times in adolescence when you have straight feelings, and there's going to be times in adolescence where you are more drawn to a female identity. That's just part of normal human development, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the kind of social transition part. So the
Okay.
social transition is letting people explore and kind of somebody might come, your child absolutely might come to you and say, I want to use they, them pronouns. Actually, just
Right.
kidding. I want to use he, him pronouns. I'm bi. I'm queer. Of course, we know that that
Yeah.
happens all the time. Um, and one of the things that is very specific in criteria listed for anybody who's going to medically transition is a long time of this stable desire and for
Right.
certain things. And so, the difference being really between what is happening in a social transition and what is happening in a medical transition. And so, in that social side, they're totally going to explore and, look around a little bit. But the study itself that found that, this 97.5%
Hmm.
of youth, to be clear, that was of those youth had already had a fairly stable couple of years identifying
Okay.
that way. And so, the day that a child comes to you and says, I started realizing yesterday that I, might want to actually be a boy, is not the day that you say, okay, they're definitely a boy, we could take their word for it. That's obviously, it's a longer process. But what ends up happening is a lot of children will come to their parents and say, I've been thinking about this for 5 years and I haven't said anything. And
Mm.
parents say, well, and we hear this in clinic a lot. Well, this is totally new to me. I didn't notice anything. My kid was always wearing dresses. And so the fact that they now don't want to, this confuses me. I never noticed anything like that before. And that is a little bit different, than I thought about this yesterday because they may have been hiding it.
Oh, that is so interesting, and that would be difficult for a parent to hear that a child had been thinking about these things for so long and they were unaware. And by the way, again, listeners, this comes up in so many different issues that children face, where the parents are not present enough sometimes to recognize the signs or the concerns or things that their kids are thinking about. So once again, we've learned that you need to be a parent and you need to be present in the life of your kids. Because one of the things, Lane, that came out in your study well, first of all, and again, I don't want to, you know, I don't want to bash people that identify as male here. But do you have any thoughts about why none of the male parents wanted to participate in the study?
Yeah, it was very interesting. So all of the parents, we tried to reach out to a lot of different parents, and we recruited through the Seattle Children's Gender Clinic and through the community in Seattle, and all the parents that we were able to interview did end up being cisgender women, mothers, and it was very interesting. And we did note in our limitations that we think we could have gotten very different responses from some of the other folks in the family, and so. It was definitely something that is important for future research because we're not really sure, exactly whether it was
Right.
a busyness or whether there were differences in how accepting they felt. Some of the moms, talked about, well, my husband was much more worried about the effects of what
Yeah.
hormones, but I was worried about fertility and that kind of stuff. So there were definitely differences that would be really interesting and important to look at as well.
Yeah, you had some of the cisgendered women in the study reporting on the cisgendered male partners on their concerns, right? They said that, and it was actually the report of a father that the mother was claiming that the father was worried that, well, what if the kid changes his mind,
Mhm.
right? That was the big concern then. And again, I just found it interesting that we didn't see more. And again, it could only be a limitation of the study of the methodology. I'll grant you that, but I think we have to keep pushing for male parents to be present and to be active and to be there. So I'm going
Mhm.
to take this opportunity. You were on a soapbox. I'm going to get on one, and I'm going to say, dads, be present in the life of your kids. There were also things that they were really reluctant to address, things that they kind of you thought or you discovered that they were kind of avoiding addressing. What were some of the really difficult topics that were really hard for parents to address?
Yeah, so one of the other ones was dysphoria. And part of
Mm,
why it seemed like that was hard for parents to address is a lot of them didn't know what it was and they misinterpreted a lot of signs from their kids. And so they couldn't really talk about it. So, briefly, gender dysphoria is the distress or discomfort that somebody feels from a mismatch between their assigned gender and their gender identity. And this can also be from how people are treating you based on how they perceive your gender, if that makes sense. So it might be that you're perfectly happy in your body and you're going around, but everybody sees you a different way than you see yourself. And that can make you feel uncomfortable or upset in your body. And this is both a medical diagnosis
Mm-hmm.
as well as an experience. And people talk about, how this feels in their bodies. And so one of the things that parents discussed wishing they'd known earlier how serious it can be, and that they had felt uncomfortable or unsure about how to actually talk about this with their kids, and in particular, how much puberty can influence dysphoria and make it a lot worse because now folks' bodies are changing and they may not be changing in the way that people want them to. And
Right.
obviously, as you've talked about on your show, puberty is uncomfortable for everyone. That is not a comfortable process for a lot of adolescents,
Right.
but it's different for folks with dysphoria, and it can be really intense. And so sometimes they might have other negative coping mechanisms. So they might start engaging in disordered eating, and it's not actually
Mm.
about their the disordered eating itself. It's a way of trying to prevent their body from changing in a way like they don't, say somebody doesn't want breasts, so they stop eating because they know
Mm-hmm.
that will keep them, their breasts small or something like that. Um, so that was one thing that parents talked about, and kids. And then another one was around just getting the basic information about non-medical gender affirming interventions. So the things that we can do to help reduce dysphoria or to make kids feel more comfortable
Mm-hmm.
that are not medical. So in addition to the social transition stuff, that's things like binding your chest, packing, which
Mm-hmm.
is using a male prosthesis for a penis, so it appears to have a penis in the pants. Stand to pee devices, so folks can use urinals. And then for trans feminine people, tucking so that there is no silhouette of the
Mm-hmm.
penis. Electrolysis, bras, things like that. So all of that stuff that a lot of kids know about because they look it up on the internet and they learn about it, and a lot of parents don't. And so they don't know how to support their kids, and they also don't know how to help them with some of the safety. So that's another one. We can talk about that for a sec before I go on too as well.
Yeah, please.
Um, yeah, so some of the safety of that is, for example, like one of our kids pointed out in the study, is that for binding, you don't want to bind, more than 8 hours a day, and you don't want to
Mm.
sleep in a binder because that's constraining the chest, and you don't want to work out in a binder if ever possible.
Mm.
So a lot of this stuff kids will look up, but they'll have such intense dysphoria that they'll say, well, I'm going to wear a binder all the time. Maybe it'll make my chest smaller. And again, parents knowing this information and helping their kids, it's nighttime. It's really important so that you can wear your binder during the day tomorrow, that you take off your binder to sleep. Your chest needs to be able to breathe. Those kinds of things are really important. And then they're also important for kind of helping parents connect with their kids and understand why they might want things down the line, like surgery when they're,
Right.
older, because otherwise the alternative is this uncomfortable binder that they're using all the time. So all of those are, aspects. Yeah.
Do you have, since we're on this path now, do you have tips for parents on how to start these discussions? Because there's some themes, obviously, in what you've been describing and what's in your paper. And some of it is the not knowing, some is kind of being oblivious, some is wanting to help, but, not having the correct information. So, do you have tips for parents to start some of these discussions with their kids that allow the parent to still be a parent and allow the kid to still, have like be in the position of not having to teach the parent?
Yeah, I would say, there's so much information out there and so many people who are going to tell you what is best for your child. And I think when it comes to your child themselves, just remember that they know themselves best and that you can trust them. But that also means they don't know the information about the world best necessarily. So
Right.
if you are coming into it with from a place of curiosity and you're saying, can you tell me why it feels so important to you to wear this, or all of that, and then you can also come with the information and say, it shows that you're also doing your research. So you can say, I was looking this up because I know that it's really important to you to find, you want to be able to tuck, and I, tuck your penis, and I want to be able to help with that. And so, I looked up that you're not ever supposed to use duct tape. Are you ever using duct tape?
Mm.
We can get some of the proper tucking materials, or why don't we set up an appointment with your doctor to talk about these things? So, in terms of why do you need to do these things, coming at it from a place of compassion and curiosity, and then taking the time to do the research to figure out, whether that's from your doctor, online as well, to figure out how to do that safely and how to support them through that.
I think that's wonderful. And because at the end of the day, like, what is a parent? A parent, their basic role is to, one, make sure that the basic needs of the child are met, and two, to make sure the child is safe. That's what the parental attachment with the child is based on, those two things. And so that, it seems like what you're recommending is just a continuation of that. If you're a parent, make sure your child is safe and that their needs are being met. And you have to be present, obviously, to know what those are and to notice the changes and the signs. But then ensuring that safety is so very, very important. There were other things that you discovered that the kids wanted from their parents. Is there anything else that you want parents to learn based on what you heard from the kids in your study?
Yeah, so one of the other ones was everybody in the study mentioned wanting parents to have some familiarity with medical gender affirming interventions if
Mm.
they're just to be able to be on the same playing field with their kids and understand what they might be going through. So this is the medical side of things. So this is things like puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapy, and potentially gender affirming surgeries. None of these, the surgeries are not necessarily happening during adolescence, but just to have
Right.
that sense of what is possible. And not all trans people want all of these things, of course. But this can help talk through some of these conversations with the parents
Hmm.
and with the kids, and like you mentioned earlier, help them be parents, which is having conversations about how to navigate safety with sex, how to navigate relationships, emotional intimacy. For example, that it's never okay for someone to ask you about your genitals or what you plan to do with them. And people think that that's okay to ask trans people, including trans kids, to say, well, do you want the surgeries? And it's important for parents to kind of have this sense of what's available and then help their kid understand how to set those boundaries, that we are going to talk
Right.
about these things, but you don't need to let your classmates or your teachers ask you, these types of questions. But in order to have those conversations, you have to be aware. Um, and then on that note, one of the things that parents ended up being a lot more concerned about were the possible long term complications. So that's probably not surprising to most people.
Right.
So, parents had questions about fertility preservation or long term surgical outcomes, or are there any health risks with hormones? And then the youth were more concerned that their parents know enough to help them navigate the medical system. And those are not actually conflicting needs. It's important for the parents to be able to
Hmm.
say, hey, have you thought about fertility? And for the kid to say, honestly, right now, I'm thinking about how I need to do. My provider told me they want me in 6 months of therapy before I can do XYZ thing, and so that's what feels really stressful to me right now. And so you can come together on those and kind of figure out how to work together, which is really important.
It, it's so, and when I was reading your findings about the gender affirming medical care, part of what I was thinking about it is that for a lot of adults who have children who are and kids who are you know enmeshed in these issues, they immediately go to the most complicated medical interventions. And I think that one of the wonderful things that is newer in our society is greater language and more opportunities to express your identity. And as you pointed out, some might involve surgery at some point, but there's now a far greater range of ways and options that are more supported than they've ever been. At least that's my perspective. Is am I right in that or not really?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. It is so true. There are so many, different paths and so many people who, may not want a lot of these things. And so,
Right.
that's why coming back to talking to the kid about it and figuring out what makes sense. And there's so many things we can do that are, reversible, as you may want to call it.
Mm.
And then, even some of the medical things that are completely reversible. So, for example, the puberty blockers, which have gotten a lot of, again, media attention, something like that, which is, definitely a medical intervention and is much further down the line and happens once, everybody in the gender clinic has communicated and everybody's talked about all of this and there's been diagnoses and all of that. But that kind of a puberty blocker just blocks puberty for a little while. It's completely reversible. And if it is taken off, then the child goes through the natal puberty and, there's no differences. And
Mm.
then if they do decide to go on hormones, then they don't have to, they may not need as much like surgical intervention later, or they may just have not had to experience all of the dysphoria that comes with, going through a really traumatic puberty that they didn't want to have. So, there's so many options out there. And truly, I don't, I, can only emphasize this. I emphasize this as much as possible. Every person's path is unique, and
Hmm.
when you go online, you're gonna see the comparison pictures of this trans man and what he looked like before, and now he's done. And
Yeah.
it's intense. It can be intense for parents to kind of see that at first. And I would say again, coming back to just talking to your kid, do you want this? And that doesn't, asking, do you want this doesn't mean that you're agreeing to take them to the gender clinic tomorrow to, get hormones. It means that you're asking them what's important to them and what they're feeling. And then you can figure out, well, okay, let's go shopping. Let's go to Target and figure out, what clothes would make you feel better.
Right.
Let's tell some family members to use these pronouns for you, and, see how you're feeling. And then get connected with a provider who can at least be affirming and tell you and your family that you're taking a lot of the right steps, and we'll see what happens as we go down the line.
It's such wonderful advice. And Lane, thinking about your research and that of your colleagues, how would you like to see this research get used?
Yeah, I hope that eventually one of the things that this could be used for in a concrete fashion is actually a curriculum for parents. So something that they can access free, of course, something that they can access that has a lot of this information for them, um, and is able to, help facilitate some of that early on. And also, I think one of the biggest things would be helping them see that they're not alone, and helping them hopefully reaching out for parental peer support. So that came up a lot in our research,
Hmm.
that there are a lot of complex emotions that happen in these processes, guilt, shame, all kinds of things. And a lot of those are emotions that you don't want to process around your child, or that you need more information about, what's going on. And so I would hope that one of the things that this can do is help parents see how important it is to connect with other parents who are going through this, have gone through this. And that way they are able to, not to process and to learn and to not necessarily process those emotions with or in front of their kids.
And Lane, I think that there is a little bit of room on the soapbox that you climbed up on, because I want to come back to it. Because the kind of things that we really want, that you want, and that I want for all kids, are rare. The notion that you have access to a caregiver that is involved in your life, and that caregiver has resources that can reach out to the community, to medical professionals, to a larger
Mhm.
support network. That's rare in our society, unfortunately. And so, like you, I want to emphasize we need to figure out policies and programs to bring this kind of support to all kids and all parents, and we need to do it now.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Lane, I just want to thank you so much for your work. I really enjoyed the paper, kind of the topic, and the title grabbed me, and I enjoyed reading it, and I was so happy that you agreed to be on talking about kids. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This is a wonderful podcast.
That was Lane Kantor. For more information about Lane, including links to several of the studies they cited, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. From there, you also can find out about upcoming episodes, suggest a topic, Learn more about me and my books, or submit your questions for future guests. Our theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans. And the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.